So thanks everyone. This is going to be a pretty quick data dump, and then we're going to get on into the fun part of the day where we do more of the interaction and talking and figuring out what our next steps should be. First, with climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, I find that when I've worked with DC, when I've worked with New York City, I've gone to New Jersey, helped out with Boulder, sometimes these words get a little bit confusing. So just wanted to throw out real quick, what do we mean by mitigation, adaptation, and resilience? And before we can quite get to what do they mean, first we have to ask ourselves, what is risk? Now, classically, risk is defined as this equation as hazard times exposure times vulnerability, where something like the risk is a danger posed by a variety of storms. They hit us a lot here in Pittsburgh. The hazard would be the storm itself. The exposure would be the number of people and the number of buildings and the number of infrastructures in the storm's way. And the vulnerability would be how likely those buildings, people, infrastructure, and whatnot are to break or get harmed by this particular hazard. And in a lot of ways, this is a very technical definition, but one way you can think about risk is, what is going to harm me in the future? What are some scenarios of possibilities that will cause me to be in trouble? A very famous floodplain manager, Gilbert White, used to say that floods are an act of nature, but flood losses are an act of mankind. And that's exactly why we start to ask, what are mitigation and adaptation techniques that we can take as people to prevent the flood that, in the absence of us, would not have caused any problem, but because we are exposed and because we are vulnerable, will now cause damages to people. So given that risk is hazard times exposure times vulnerability, generally speaking, risk prevention, there's a lot of different jargon we can use here, but risk prevention is something on the order of reducing the hazard in some way, shape, or form. Risk preparedness is reducing that exposure and vulnerability. Okay? So where do mitigation and adaptation fit in? Well, here's one of the points where this gets really tricky already. Climate change mitigation means reducing greenhouse gas emissions, okay? And it's one particular type of mitigation that when we say mitigation, when we've looked at what Pittsburgh has done with the Climate Action Plan and others, what other cities have done as well, usually they mean mitigation in the sense of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Well, a second definition of mitigation is hazard mitigation, and that is very, very similar to the adaptation. Both of these things tend to focus more on the exposure and the vulnerability, and they tend to, they're basically very similar. There are ways to reduce the exposure and the vulnerability so we don't have that risk actually occur. And typically, adaptation tends to be, climate change adaptation especially, tends to be informed by what we think might happen in the future with climate change. Generally speaking, adaptation can mean adaptation to anything, so it doesn't need the climate change perspective, which is why I left it just adaptation here. Hazard mitigation tends to be informed by past events, but you guys do a great job also thinking about the future and what can go on. So in a lot of ways, these two different groups of professionals are basically doing exactly the same thing. And so finally, what is resilience? We're doing this Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities or whatever the name of it is. It's really awesome. It's really great. The first 33 cities, fantastic examples, and we're going to be one of the next 33. But before we can get there, we need to know what it means to be resilient. So I like to think of the simple definition of resilience of all of these things. It's reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. It's making sure that we're reducing our exposure and vulnerability so there's not a problem. The National Academy of Sciences, and we have our friend Sam up here in the front who works with some of those folks, they define it as the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, or more successfully adapt to actual or potential adverse events.
They didn't take our science communication training.
So given my tendency to use flowcharts and stuff, an event hits a system and there's some sort of resilience path that's a function of time and the change in the system that hopefully gets you back to the way things were prior to the event, or better. Resilient systems include short and long term. They can run anything from land use planning, coastal stuff that's going to be 30 or 40 or 50 years in the making, to some of those comprehensive emergency management planning right after the disaster. And best practices really do advance multiple goals for resilience. We have to tie together so many different groups. And here's a chart. I think some of these slides will be available for y'all later, but it's just showing that if you have climate change adaptation and climate mitigation, that there's some things that are both and interconnected. So I'm going to give you a quick 2 minutes on some of the things we've been doing at CMU. There's a lot of great folks in the room as well that we can chat with during the discussion from CMU, Pitt, RAND, and several others. So really quickly, I'm going to show you some of the vulnerabilities we found and then some of the recommendations. Clearly, everybody in the room knows that combined sewer overflows, flash flooding, and river floods hit everywhere in Pittsburgh and are quite a problem. This is just one map of looking at one of the watersheds. The map on the left is the altitude, or the elevation. The map on the right is the percent of impervious surface area. And so we see that, and the orange is basically, or red is more than 20% is impervious. So these two things combine to make a lot of areas really prone to a lot of flooding. We also did a lot of work on a heat vulnerability index. This is very similar to a social vulnerability index, which can help guide policy in some ways on what areas are most vulnerable to hazards. The map in the middle, the red areas are the most vulnerable. The map up on the top right is normalized by area, and the bottom right is normalized by population, depending on what policy you're looking at. And there's definitely some areas that pop out as being highly vulnerable. And this particular one was actually to heat, so we added some air conditioning and other data based on peer-reviewed literature. The population, the infrastructure, and the climate will continue to change. We hope in Pittsburgh it's going to get better. Well, not hope. We know it's going to get, growing, thriving, more population, more infrastructure. But these things are going to be taxed by not only the aging infrastructure we already have put under stress, but also future climate. And the class had a couple different policy recommendations based on this. And just to throw this out, this is an undergraduate class, and we are continuing some of the work throughout the summer. And some of the things that they said, very generally, consider large-scale permanent changes. There's tons of different things you could do there. Possibly identify additional cooling centers, and that could be useful or not, depending on some of the other things that are done. Promote some rain barrels, perhaps, and of course these have to be used intelligently and dumped out at the right times. And really learn from other cities and our academic capital and all you great folks in the room. We have so much that we can share. There's a lot of existing funding we can really leverage. And then we can advertise these efforts a little bit better. We did a survey finding that a lot of the Pittsburgh residents weren't really aware that Pittsburgh was truthfully doing anything about the flooding or the resilience or the greenhouse gas mitigation. They were like, when you told them about the problem, they were like, yes, this is a really bad problem. We should solve it. We should do something. But the city's not doing anything. And we're like, well, wait. The city's doing a lot of great work, and here's some of these things. And as we tended to introduce these to the folks we interviewed, just randomly people off of the streets, they became much, much more positive about the city and what was going on. And we have a lot more information about any of these and also very specific detailed recommendations. And basically, what the number one thing that we think is most important is this good risk communication. There are a lot of different things that are important that we can do structurally, we can do internally. But talking with the people about what the flash floods are, where their heat vulnerabilities are, asking people about the problem, and then tailoring the communication effectively will help the best in moving forward. And so here's my contact information. Feel free to chat with me now while we're still here for the next hour. And I'm happy to give you any more of that information or published literature. And one last thing, I would be remiss again if I didn't point out all the other great academic resources you have in the room, from Jordan to Hyung to Pei to Yuri to Alexia to Paul. You guys have a lot of great folks here, so please use us. That's why we're here. We want to help.